So I'm Ron Feldman. I'm the first vice president here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And if you know what that means, then you've been following the Fed too closely. That's our obscure word for chief operating officer. And today I have the privilege of introducing Professor Ed Glaeser, who is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard. I'm sure everyone in the room knows Ed's distinguished background. I won't go into it. I will recommend his Wikipedia page. It's very long and detailed, so someone out there is following Ed closely. I noticed that it had been updated in the last couple of days. Maybe too closely, Ed. You might want to look into that. I think the one thing I will highlight from Ed's official bio that I thought speaks to why he's speaking right now, speaking at the nature of this conference and coming last, was he said his focus is thinking about the roles of cities as centers of idea transmission. I think that really gets to the heart of the geographical, place-based nature of the conference today. And so with that, let me turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Ron. And thank you for having me. Clearly, it speaks to the fact that I teach a lot of very computer-intensive 19-year-olds who have nothing better to do with their mind when they're putting off studying for the midterm, which we had yesterday. All right, so let me start, which is not that far away from where Oren was. Let me start with what I consider to be America's largest unsolved social problem, which is the fact that when I was born in 1967, fewer than 5% of prime-aged males, and prime-aged, of course, is 25 to 54, a definition that I increasingly take offense against, as I'm running up against that 54-year deadline, 5% of them were jobless. For most of the last decade, more than 15% of prime-age men have been jobless. Now, as we know, the unemployment rate, thanks to the good offices of the Fed, the unemployment rate is incredibly low, but we still have a reduction of the labor force participation from close to 98% in the late 1950s to under 89% today, right? A 9% gap, at least 5 million men. And those men are not, I think by any reasonable measure, better off than they would be if they were unemployed. Pretty much everything that we can see about them suggests that this is not some genial consumption of leisure as envisioned by Keynes in the 1930s, but something that has gone quite wrong. And if in terms of accepting the externalities related to this, if you're just if Tom wants to be a straight Minnesota guy, it's fine if we think about the problem of underemployment as being just the fiscal externalities associated with that, which I think are considerable. But I think almost surely there are other social costs of this which are quite considerable. I'm going to be focused on male rather than female labor force participation, not because I don't think that female labor force participation isn't incredibly interesting and important and that female joblessness isn't important, but it's just a very, very different phenomenon, right? It's a phenomenon with a very different time series path, although it also peaked around 1998. So it does seem like that it has come down. But the geography is going to be different. The lives of women who are not in the labor force look very, very different than the lives of men who are not in the labor force. This is just showing the gap between the prime male not working rate and the unemployment rate. And both of them, of course, show, again, the positive effects of the Fed's magnificent policies to bring people back into the labor force. But the numbers are still very, very high if you focus on the not working rate other than the unemployment rate. Perhaps most worrisome for me is the fact that it's not just that you have an overall rise in the number, you have a steady rise in the share of these men who have been out of the labor force for more than a year. Okay, and that's what the bottom line shows. So the top line is showing the overall not working rate. The bottom line is showing this inexorable rise in the 1 year plus of these men. This shows the division by cohorts. And really, to me, two cohorts stand out. So the cohort born in 1940 looks like it has remarkably lower joblessness during all of its early decades, right, than the ones that followed, the ones that were born in 50, 60, and 70. And the cohort that's born in 1980 looks worse off than any of the ones that came before it. So in terms of the cohort analysis, joblessness is significantly lower for the 1940 than for the baby boomers that followed, but significantly higher for the generation born and coming of age in the Great Recession. Of course, there are big divisions by education. The top number is less than high school. The bottom is college. To me, at least, I look at this and I still see college having some payoff, but it could, of course, all be selection. The biggest rise has been in terms of high school and some college, in terms of the change in this. But those gradations are really quite large. Disability is surely some part of this, and I don't mean to make a causal claim of this, but in terms of just adding up the numbers, while the disability numbers are huge and terrifying by almost any metric, the bulk of these men who are long-term jobless are not on disability. Right? They're finding some other way to pay for themselves. It's not flat out disability. So this is not a causal claim about what disability is doing or not doing, just simply an accounting sense. They're not on disability. This is us versus comparable OECD countries. So I just have Australia, France, UK, Canada, and Germany. These are probably 5 countries that we think of as being reasonable comparisons for the US. And at this point in time, we are second to the bottom in terms of the employment to population rate. The United Kingdom is higher. Germany is substantially higher. Canada is about the same as us. Australia is slightly higher. So it's not that we are in some sense different. And this is very different from the sort of narrative that I remember from the 1980s, where America was this place that worked and Europe was this place that didn't work because of benighted European policies. That doesn't feel like it rings as true anymore. Now that's less true if I put up instead Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal. That would not seem as true. But certainly relative to these wealthier ones, we seem, if anything, like a negative outlier rather than a positive one. And this is on labor force participation rate. So here we really do look quite different. None of the other countries since the mid-2000s have had a labor force participation rate for prime-age male that is as low as the U.S. number. We really are somewhat unusual on this. Now, I'm going to segue now, so many of you may know those broad numbers. I'm going to segue now to a slightly more regional analysis. Yes, of course, Neil.
What about just the marriage effect? So what if it's just the husbands are staying home and the wives are working?
Okay, they're not doing that. Okay, yeah, I'm going to come back to that later. They're not married and they're watching TV. But I promise you, I will have you two things. The view that like this is some benign thing where they're out of work and they're like taking care of the kids, it's a very small fraction of who those people are. So you may know some of them, and they may very well not be a major public policy problem at all. But that does not look at all like the bulk of these things. So there are significant regional gaps. So here I just divide up major metros, smaller metro areas, and non-metro areas. And as you can see, the joblessness rate, this is the EPOP rate, is much lower outside of metropolitan areas in these wonderful rural communities that Neil told us about earlier. This is where the joblessness is lower. And if you think about the future of work and you think about what less skilled people are likely to do in the economy in the 21st century, it's easy to think about models in thriving metropolitan areas. I mean, it's easy to think about service sector jobs where less skilled work is still going to have plenty of uses, and many of us experience very high wages that we pay for service sector employees, which suggests that there's lots of the labor demand there is there. It's much harder to see what happens in rural West Virginia, right? In rural Mississippi, in other areas where there are not high earning people who are part of a knowledge-oriented export sector who can then pay for those services. And that's, I think, part of what we're seeing here. This is the map of joblessness in the U.S. And at least when I look at this, I see the epicenter of these issues being in America's eastern heartland, which is sort of a region that begins in Louisiana and Mississippi, stretches up through Appalachia, and ends up maybe in upper Michigan. There also, of course, is significant joblessness in Arizona and New Mexico. I should stress that these big areas here don't have a lot of people in them. So the ones that are there are. And then, of course, there's a lot in Northern California and Southern Oregon. That's another area where these numbers are very high. And the dark reds, of course, are over 26%. So these are areas where more than a quarter of prime-age males are not working. So that's a really very different world than the world of the 1960s, or even the world of the 1980. This is the same map in 1980. And the only places where you see anything like that is in the heart of Appalachia. Right? So this is that's eastern Kentucky, and a little bit in out west. But this is just a very different view of the world. The other thing I want you to take away from this is both this map and this map, right? You can see that the 9th district looks pretty good. So, and that's going to be a theme on this, and that in fact America doesn't have one, the division of the U.S. that many people have in the back of their minds, which is a division between coastal cities and flyover states, is a deeply misleading vision. That in fact the world of the 9th district is a different world than the world of Mississippi, the world of Appalachia, and that's a sort of very important fact. This is women. So this again points out the view that the issues surrounding female labor force participation are just different than the issues surrounding men. Here there's much more of a north-south divide, which if I were saying anything looks to me more cultural than it does on the same sort of economic divisions. It's really the South that has the higher rates of female labor force participation and the North that has the lower ones. This view of the eastern heartland as being the sort of epicenter of joblessness in the U.S. It also goes along with other social problems that appear to show up disproportionately in the eastern heartland. So this is opioid consumption. I forget where this data comes from, but again, shows this eastern heartland map where it seems to be highest there. These are opioid deaths from 2013. Again, there's more heterogeneity. Nevada looks bad, particularly bad along drug poisoning fatalities. But again, the Eastern Heartland stands out. This is incarceration rates. Here, there's slightly more of a southern thing, but if anything, the Eastern Heartland still looks a bit higher. And this relates, I guess, to Oren's map on taking assistance from the federal government. This comes from. It's a census thing, but there's just the share of federal government expenditures per capita by state. And again, you can see those numbers are highest in the Eastern Heartland, except for places like Massachusetts, where, of course, we have the beauties of NIH and NSF funding our universities, which also puts us on the dole as well. To me, at least, it's helpful to think about dividing U.S. up into this Eastern and Western Heartland. And this is the division that I'm going to make in terms of states. This non-geographic split is based on the entry of the state into the Union, and my dividing year is 1840. That's a lot of personal emotional attachment to the election of 1840 and Tippecanoe and Tyler too, being a critical element here. But it puts, of course, Minnesota and Wisconsin on the Western Heartland and Illinois and Missouri on the Eastern Heartland. This shows joblessness in those three regions. So today, the division is quite clear. The Western Heartland has the lowest joblessness rates of any of the three regions, and it has since 1988. Okay, so the Western Heartland is, in fact, the most employed part of the U.S. in terms of prime-age males, and has for 30 years. In the 1990s, the coasts and the Eastern Heartland were vying with each other, but for much of the last 20 years, the Eastern Heartland has been really far above the coasts. And again, rates that went over 20% during the height of the Great Recession. This shows female labor force, female employment rates for these three regions. Again, no differences in these things that show up. Again, pointing out those differences. Now, the Eastern Heartland, the Western Heartland, and the coast have both enjoyed success over the last 20 years, but they've enjoyed it along different dimensions. So this is GDP growth off a base starting in 1966. As you can see, both the coastal states and the Western Heartland are growing, the Eastern Heartland much less so. But the nature of the growth takes different forms. This is GDP per worker. Okay, again, starting somewhere quite similar in the late 1970s. Coastal states are now quite higher than the other two regions. So GDP per worker is going up higher in the coasts. These are the number of workers. Okay, so this is the Western Heartland, vastly outdistancing in terms of number of workers the growth from the coastal states. Okay, so one is increasing Q, the other is increasing W. One is increasing the number of bodies, the other is increasing the wages per person. Which may have something to do with the fact that the coastal cities of the U.S. have made it increasingly difficult to provide housing in those areas. And I will come back to that theme again. But the relative success of the Western Heartland should, in fact, give us at least some hope that, in fact, Eastern Kentucky doesn't have to try and be like Silicon Valley to succeed. It just needs to be like Minnesota, right? It just needs to do something which is more in line. Now, finally, this is the fact that many of you may know from the work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton, which is the declining, the end to the positive improvements in male life expectancy over the last 30 years. So they emphasize that men in the U.S. have stopped gaining ground in terms of reductions in mortality. This shows mortality rate for prime-age men, 1970 to 2015. Red, again, Eastern Heartland, blue, green. Throughout almost all of the period, the Western Heartland had the lowest mortality rates for men. It was the healthiest region. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the coasts were the worst. Okay, this was during the era of AIDS, the era of the crack epidemic. But since then, the coasts have come down and now are lower than the Western Heartland. But look, it's the Eastern Heartland that has had no gains for 35 years. Right? This is the epicenter of where this health thing is happening. Right? Again, it's an Eastern Heartland phenomenon. I'm not going to say a lot in terms of explaining why I think these differences occur. I have a very simple two-factor model of economic success that I always keep in the back of my mind, one of which is, human capital and institutions and whatever we think the complementarity and interplay between these two areas are. That simple model doesn't do badly in terms of explaining why the Eastern Heartland looks different. So this is education in 2015 across the U.S. Again, the Eastern Heartland looks unusually low. And of course, this is reflecting two historic phenomena, one of which is the Eastern Heartland was the birthplace of large-scale industry in the U.S., and consequently, there were relatively high wages for men who didn't go on get formal education. And the second is the southern part of this is it was the most cotton-oriented part of the slave economy. It was the place in which the Jim Crow South was most extreme, and it was the place in which education was least well developed. This shows education in the three regions, just the share of adults with college degrees. We started off, and this is maybe if there's one warning element in the Western Heartland to pay attention to, in 1977, the rates were about equal. And in fact, if you go back earlier, I mean, this is the Western Heartland is the birth of the American high school movement, right? I mean, this is an area that was historically better educated than the coast. Since 1980, the coasts have really soared ahead, and this is related, of course, to Enrico's work about the divergence of human capital across space. The Western Heartland has increased, but increased much more slowly. The Eastern Heartland has increased more quickly, but it starts from a much lower base. So the education gap is really there. Education is associated with poor performance along political institutions. One of the measures that I like on this is the share of corruption cases started by federal law enforcement agents against local government officials, because that avoids the problem in a really corrupt state. You don't indict your own people, right? So again, this looks pretty good for the Eastern Heartland view. In my own work with Raven Sachs, using these measures of corruption in the U.S., we also found that, of course, education is a very strong predictor of which areas are more corrupt. Since Morris is here, at least there is some evidence that occupational licensing, which I'm taking here as being a sort of measure of misgovernment, at least in terms of this occupation. This is the map of licensing for opticians. So these are not the guys who are actually doctors. These are the guys who tell you whether or not you should have round glasses or square glasses, right? Which clearly needs an occupational licensing, because what if Morris got round glasses when clearly he needs square glasses for himself? This again lines up with the Eastern Heartland as well. Naturally, some part of the Eastern Heartland's problem is that it was this manufacturing area. So this is the share of the population that was in manufacturing in 1980. And the areas that had more manufacturing had more declines in manufacturing and more increases in the joblessness rate. So these are the places with the starkest declines in manufacturing. And they had, this 0.3 means that the joblessness rate went up by 30 percentage points. Okay, so this is a very big number over here in these places that had really radical shutdowns in terms of manufacturing. And if you look at the change in the joblessness rate for people with less than high school education, this is a number that's like 0.4. Okay, so that's again a 40 percentage point increasing. So the Eastern Heartland really suffered through this very painful deindustrialization during its time period. Now, Neil sort of suggested this idea that this is all good because they're just good family men who are spending time with their kids and they're all happy. All right, Keynes suggested it was good, that they were all going to be consuming a lot of leisure. One of the first signs that maybe it's not so good, and maybe in fact we as a population have been making a mistake that in fact by focusing too much on inequality relative to joblessness, comes from the life satisfaction data. Now, I could not be more on point that satisfaction is not at all what we mean is utility as economists. These are not the same things. And yet, high levels of misery, of self-reported misery, still should be taken as a sign that something is going wrong, that there's something that's not great about this. So, roughly at the national level, the share of men who say that they are highly unsatisfied with their lives, who are earning more than 50K, that's about 2%. Earning 35 to 50K, that's about 4%. Earning less than 35K, that's about 6%. Jobless, that's 18%. Okay, so it's a huge jump up in terms of this. If you actually look at the fairly significant fraction of them who are living alone, right, you get to numbers like 30 to 40%. Right, so you get to very high levels of self-reported human misery. If they're living with others, it's lower. If they're long-term unemployed, it's still close to 20%. So it's still a very high number relative to a norm for this measure, which is about 2%. Physical health is, of course, also much lower. This shows the share of these people. And obviously, that's a two-sided causality issue around this. And this is just the time use of this. So we're looking at employed versus not working in the three regions. Maybe we'll just focus on the Eastern Heartland. So you see what happens when they don't work is you see the number of hours spent working drops from 382 to 328, right? So that's a 354-minute increase in time that's created by a reduction in the amount of time spent working. Where does that 354 minutes go? Well, in terms of caring for others, well, that jumps from 42 to 51. Okay, so that's 9 minutes of increase in caring for others that's associated with these non-working men. So there's a guy who's doing it, but there's not a lot of it. What goes up is 160-odd minutes, 161 minutes in watching TV, although there's a nice new paper by Eric Hurst that points out that video gaming is starting to eat into that TV time, and that's something we should watch. But the TV time is still only a 17-minute bump up relative to the huge number. Plus, there's about another 75 minutes of personal care, which is sleeping. Okay, so there is really a gap, but not a lot of huge activity in terms of taking care of others or doing joint things. And I somewhere I had that number. I lost that graph. The number of maybe it comes out later. The number of them who are actually married is actually fairly low, whereas the number of them who are living with their parents is much higher. Now, spatial differences, spatial heterogeneity. I haven't argued yet that there's a externality here that we should be worried about. I mean, I've argued it. I haven't shown you anything that goes along with it, but I will. But I'm going to then push the idea that we may want to think about this regional stuff in a way that we didn't in the past. So historically, many economists, myself included, were deeply hostile to the idea of place-based policies. It seemed to me 20 years ago that it was madness to think that we were going to tax America's successful regions to try and induce people to stay in less successful regions. That seemed like a big mistake. But there are changes in the U.S., and there are changes that might make us rethink, at the very least, not necessarily spatial redistribution, but more spatial targeting of policies, more policies that are better attuned to the parameters in particular areas. So the first thing I want to point out is that regional heterogeneity in U.S. incomes is not in any way, shape, or form new. In 1950, Mississippi was the poorest state in the Union, and there were 18 states in 1950 with per capita incomes that were double that of Mississippi. Okay? Today, Mississippi is still the poorest state in the Union. There's not a single state in the Union with per capita incomes that are double that in Mississippi. And anybody who thinks that sort of the regional disparities in U.S. incomes are sort of remarkable and new just has no memory of what the world of the Jim Crow South looked like. I mean, this was a world. It becomes even starker if you actually look at what the people's lives were in terms of having indoor plumbing, having paving, having things like that. So that's not new. But joblessness is a new twist. And if you think the problem is not low incomes, but if you think the problem is joblessness and that there are externalities around joblessness or Keynesian stuff that my co-author makes me put in that I don't understand, because all I know about macro I learned from Bob Lucas. So then this stuff should lead us to relook at regional policies again. And finally, there are good reasons to think that America is becoming less fluid geographically and more European in many ways. And Abby's work, of course, is a major contribution to this, and you already saw some of this. So I'm not going to add to the declining migration. This is the inter-county migration rate. I mean, if you wanted to keep a fact in the back of your head, for 40 years prior to 1992, the U.S. never had an inter-county migration rate, meaning the share of people who switched county lines that was below 6%. Right? For the entire past decade, we haven't had a rate above 4%. So that's a 1/3 decline in that rate over a 15-year period, which is really quite striking. And again, Abby knows much more about this than I do. Moreover, right, so you might conclude from this that, boy, if people just moved more, we're sure that would be a good thing. Two things should make you worried about this, one of which is the fact that migration, when it occurs, tends to be very skill biased. Okay, and this again relates to the skill divergence across areas. But this looks at the PUMA level, the public use microsample area. This is the college graduation rate at the PUMA level for non-migrants, right, for people who are staying in the area. This is the college graduation rate for migrants. And what you can see is pretty much all out-migration is skill biased, but it's particularly stark for the least skilled areas. And this is exactly the sort of brain drain from sort of less skilled areas that doesn't feel like, as much as we may think that it's sort of a great idea that San Francisco should build more and enable people to migrate from the eastern heartland to San Francisco. The people who are going to be migrating are going to be the most skilled people from those areas. And they're going to leave, if anything, if you believe in any kind of local human capital externalities at all, they're going to be leaving the areas that they leave behind even more bereft, even more troubled. So that doesn't make me change my view that San Francisco should not regulate its housing as tightly as it does. But it does make me wonder whether or not a full-fledged exodus, a further exodus out of West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky is really an unfettered good. The other thing that's really quite puzzling, and this is a Peter Ganong and Danny Shoag fact, is that we've no longer seen migration, particularly the less skilled, to high-wage areas. So prior to 1980, migration tended to be very income-directed, meaning that the initial income in a period was very good at predicting which areas experienced the most migration, particularly the skilled. That's really stopped. Right, and that's an interesting phenomenon which is related to this general slowdown. One explanation for this is the fact that successful areas have made it increasingly difficult to build. And that's a real change from U.S. history. Right? If you think about us over the last 200 years, 250 years, we have always been a country full of people moving across regions. But when the farmers of rocky New England soil decided to move to the Ohio River Valley in the 18 teens or 1820s, no one told them they couldn't put up their balloon frame houses. Right? And when the workers of the farm areas moved to tenements in the 1890s. The tenements may have been crappy, but they were cheap, and no one was telling them they couldn't put it up. Same thing for the Oklahoma farmers who went west during the Dust Bowl, right? We're in the first time in history in which, our most successful metropolitan areas, right, Silicon Valley above all, right, has areas within Silicon Valley where there are 40-acre minimum lot sizes, right? So we've decided to allow local regulation to say no to actually enjoying the productivity benefits that would come from moving people there. This is related to this fact, which Enrico deserves credit for in 2005. I have a version of this in 2005. I have a version in 2006. That there's this positive correlation between the change in the share of the population with college degrees and the initial share. And that's related to the fact that income convergence across areas appears to have stopped almost exactly when Barrow and Sally Martin identified it. Okay? That this was a fact that was incredibly robust, right, until 1980, until 1990. And so this is 1980 median income at the Puma level and change in log median income 1980 to 2010. This is slightly negative, but if you do anything to to deal with the fact that measurement error will naturally induce mean reversion, like just instrument for the median income with the 75th and the 25th, right, that will cause this coefficient to go positive. Right, so there's very little sense in which America had this thing, which is exactly the flip side. That's exactly where that Mississippi fact was coming from. Mississippi had much faster income growth than any other place in the U.S. between 1950 and 1980. Now that I've overstated. It had very fast income growth relative to the U.S. as a whole. Right? That phenomenon of poorer places seeing faster income growth has really diminished. Joblessness as well, right? Joblessness traditionally mean reverted. For those of you who remember Blanchard and Katz's Regional Evolutions paper from the Brookings Papers on Economic Affairs, 1992, right? They had this great graph showing unemployment at the state level in 1985 and unemployment at the state level in 1975, and they were totally orthogonal to each other, right? Meaning that like whatever was pushing unemployment right up in 1975, it had totally disappeared. And this is one version of this, right? This is the state level mean reversion of those not working rates. That's what's happened over the past 20 years. Right, that mean reversion has totally disappeared. And if you want to look at persistence, right, this is the not working rate at the state level on the change in the not working rate from 1980 to 2014. That's going up, right? And this is just the persistence of not working rates at the Puma level. So both this R squared is over 80%, right, meaning the 1980 level does an incredibly good job of predicting the not working rate 30 years later, and the coefficient's more than 1. Right, so these are really persistent pockets of joblessness in the U.S. The view that somehow or other the fluidity of the cycle is taking care of this stuff is really just not a correct view. Now, is geographic sclerosis an argument for revisiting place-based policies? So let's just remember what are the arguments, and I've made them as much as anyone else has, against having place-based policies, right? So counter-argument number one is subsidizing declining places keeps people in dysfunctional local economies. That it seemed to me after Hurricane Katrina that New Orleans had done a terrible job caring for its poorer children for decades, and the idea that we were going to rebuild New Orleans so it's exactly the way that it was prior to 2005 didn't sound like a great idea to me. That force is still there, but it becomes less important if you think the migration rate is much lower, if you think the migration response is going to be smaller. Counter-argument number two, subsidizing any place leads to capitalization in rents. The poor tenant who doesn't like contemporary art may well be hurt by the Bilbao Guggenheim. Right? You may well have a very successful local innovation that boosts up rents in the place that actually makes the poor residents there worse off. That's also true, but again, if there are fewer people on the margin for moving into this area, if people are less mobile, it becomes less important. Obviously, the relative importance of this versus this, capitalization versus short migration, depends upon the housing supply elasticity. And some declining places like Detroit have fixed housing supplies. Counter-argument number three, this is certainly true. Some place-based policies can create pockets of high unemployment and low human capital, but it does seem like we're getting that already. And the question is whether or not we can maybe reform our policies in a way that perhaps does less of that. Counter-argument number four is that infrastructure-based, place-based policies can also lead to monumental waste. Well, that one is certainly still true. And this is Detroit's People Mover monorail, funded after the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1973, right, which acted as if Detroit, which may well have needed added investment in skills or safety or other things that actually deliver value, the last thing it needed was a monorail to glide over essentially empty streets. And the hallmark of declining regions, they have an abundance of structures and infrastructure relative to the level of demand. Right? More than 90% of the homes in Central City Detroit were valued significantly below construction costs even in 1980. You didn't need to have urban renewal policies that built more housing, and you certainly didn't need to have this monorail when you can run a bus at any speed you want down the empty streets of Detroit. Okay, so with that in mind, and continuing to be wary about place-based policies, let's walk through a litany of what are potential arguments for it. Argument number one is externalities. So the field of urban economics has come to the view that there are at least two prominent local externalities that we should worry about. One of which are agglomeration economies, and a typical estimate is that if I double the amount of economic activity in an area, I increase productivity by 0.06 log points, by 6%, holding everything else constant. That's, I actually believe that. You might not, but I do kind of believe that. And then there are also human capital externalities, a typical estimate, and you may or may not believe this, but as the share of adults in college in an area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your earnings go up as well by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant. Again, you may not believe that, but there are plenty of people who do believe in these local externalities. The problem is that while these externalities mean that a decentralized spatial equilibrium is unlikely to be a social optimum, we don't know, and I think we're unlikely ever to know, enough about the shape of these externalities to be sure about where we'd want to shift skilled people or economic activity. Right? Should we be moving New Yorkers to West Virginia to enable the West Virginians to enjoy more spillovers, or should we be moving West Virginians to New Yorkers? Right? And once you add in congestion externalities of a variety of different forms, it becomes incredibly hard to have any degree of surety about what we should be doing in terms of moving activity across space. And that certainly is part of what leads me in general to think the federal government's job is to be spatially neutral on these things and not to try and push economic activity, at least when these things are concerned, not to try and push people one way or the other. Place-based argument number two is something like either insurance or equity, right? So you can either have an equity view or you can just take the view that there are place-based shocks, there are missing markets for place-based insurance. In 1967, Detroit and Boston had similar incomes. Now Boston has 40% higher incomes. Wouldn't a sensible policy be to insure people against these shocks based on place of birth in a way that doesn't really distort things to just orthogonal shocks that are unexpected as at the time of birth? It's hard not to say that that argument would be welfare improving if it could be done at low cost, right, and done in a way that was relatively non-distortionary. But the problem is in the US, I can't imagine using a geography that's really finer than states. I mean, everything in our political economy is geared around states. And states only explain 1.2% of income variation. Right? So the extra insurance benefit you'd get from some state-based hedging thing is trivial. Now, if you got down to Pumas, you'd get to 7.1% of incomes. But it would be hard to figure out how you're really going to do it based on Puma birth, or with Raj's opportunity data, we want to do it based on tract of birth. But it's impossible to imagine that coming out of American political economy in a way that actually works. So I think this is right, but at least if it's done a little coarse geography, it's unlikely to be particularly effective. So third, and this is the one I actually do believe in, which is that different elasticities should mean different policies, okay? And if you have different conditions in different markets, having a one-size-fits-all government policy can be a little crazy. Let me take an extreme case where I've always argued this. I've argued this for many years, which is the low-income housing tax credit provides a subsidy for housing that is roughly the same in Detroit, in Dallas, and in Boston or New York City. There are plausible reasons for subsidizing housing in Boston, mostly if you think that government regulations create a wedge between the value that people have in it and the cost of producing it. Right? It's certainly a plausible policy there. There is no sense in which having a low-income housing tax credit, subsidizing housing, makes any sense in Dallas, right? You have or Houston, you have an incredibly well-functioning private market, almost assuredly yields crowd out at a one-to-one basis, right? So, and in Detroit, where we've just identified that they have an abundance of structures, why does it possibly make sense to subsidize new construction in the city of Detroit? 3 different housing markets, 3 totally different supply elasticities. You shouldn't have one-size-fits-all policies. Another analogy, which is maybe helpful. Let's say you have limited resources and you're trying to solve a social problem, right? Like the existence of some kind of externality or like crime. Police departments for decades have followed a strategy of hotspots policing, which is you throw more cops to places where there is more crime. How can that possibly not make sense? And so in a world in which you had limited resources or limited ability to fight against non-employment, surely it makes sense to target that more towards areas where you think the effect of those policies are higher. So let's take the case that I'm actually making. So either you can think about having, and there are 2 thought experiments that I want you to have in mind, one of which is having something like EITC, but stronger and more targeted towards, not just towards single parents with kids, something that will actually impact prime-age men. And you've got a bucket of it to spend. Question is, is there some sense in which you want those subsidies to be uniform nationally, or might you want to spend it more in areas where you might think it might have more effect? Second thought experiment, think about reforming disability in a very particular way. I can engage in a budget-neutral twist where I'm going to reduce the base payments for disability, but I'm going to enable you to keep more of your earnings as you go out on the earning spectrum. So we're going to reduce the baseline viability, but we're going to reduce also the disincentives, the hard barrier to working. Wouldn't it make more sense to think about doing that twist in an area in which you think the employment effects of that will be larger, right? Doesn't it make more sense to have policies that favor work in a state like West Virginia, right, where you think you have a lot of people on the margin, than in a state like Seattle or a city like Seattle where you don't? So just where do I, so again, because there are a lot of responsible economists here, let me just sort of emphasize, I actually do think that the social costs of employment go beyond these fiscal externalities, but the numbers that you get from just what people are, how much government support they're getting if they're working versus not working, and what they're paying in taxes are fairly considerable, right? So that wedge between working and not working, that fiscal externality is a significant number. Moreover, a lot of these men who are not working are living with someone else. So this just shows the share of them who are living with a parent. And in terms of the long-term not working, somewhat amazingly, over 25%, now close to 30% of the long-term not working men in the U.S. are living with a parent, which is sort of amazing. Now, I wouldn't normally think of like parent-child interactions as having any form of an externality, but maybe there is some, in the sense that if you think about a kid who is making a decision whether or not to piss off his boss or not to show up, it may well be that there's an inability of the parent to bribe him in the moment to induce that kid to stay at work, right? So it's conceivable, at least, that there is a Coasian failure here in terms of the parental transfers, which then end up being considerable. This shows, finally, I get to Neil's thing about, this is the share that have an employed spouse, this is the share that have a non-working spouse, and this is the joblessness rate among people with no spouses. So it's much higher among people with no spouses. Okay, so adding up a bunch of calculations, which you may or may not agree with, we get to an externality associated with joblessness, which is about 36% of low-income wages. That is not a number I want to hang myself on it at any way, shape, or form. We think we went through reasonable numbers, but different people can differ, and I'm very happy for this to be the beginning of a discussion rather than an end. And that number, though, looks relatively uniform spatially, but at least this is how I think about different employment elasticities. Think of there as being a net return to working with some sort of unimodal distribution, and there being, in a city that has very low non-working rates, the share there on the margin are also low, which is what you'd get from a unimodal distribution, right? You get and at the extreme, it's obvious. If 100% of the people are working, there's no one on the margin, right? And as you move up towards 30% of the population who aren't working, you have many more people on the margin. Now that's just, I'm putting that up as a conceptual claim. The real question is sort of empirically, is that true? And I'll return to the evidence on that in a second. I've already worked through this. I'll go through again. I like to associate the nice. So the nice version. So Larry doesn't want to be on the record as supporting any reductions to any disability payments for anyone anywhere. So it's clear that he's only in favor of the nice version of this, which is we have employment subsidies that are going higher. In other words, I'm willing to take on the mean version, which is I'm actually going to take stuff away from the disabled who are not working and give it to the disabled who are working. And just to be clear from that, if you take the mean ed version, so all of those who worried about distortions of inducing people to move to West Virginia or stay in New Orleans, right? I can do this twist in a way that's totally fiscally neutral, in a sense that you have no added benefit from moving to West Virginia. I just have scheduled the benefits so that you promote work in West Virginia more and you're more generous to the non-employed in Seattle. Now, do you have higher elasticities in states with high levels of joblessness? We do this in 3 different thought experiments. So we don't actually have what I'd really want, which would be changes in like the generosity of disability payments. I don't have that. What I do have is a variety of different shocks to labor demand, and I'm going to interact those shocks with the historic non-working rate, and I ask us, do we have a larger impact on joblessness in places where joblessness is historically higher? The first shock I do is just the Puma level Bartic analysis, where we've got the Bartic employment growth, its impact on the not working rate. I'm going to interact that with the historical not working rate. It's a quite large negative interaction, meaning that Bartic does more in terms of reducing not working in places which have a high not working rate. This idea that there are more people on the margin in those areas is at least plausible. We then do Oterdorn-Hansen on this, so we do Oterdorn-Hansen interacting. It's a little bit murkier than Bartic, but again, it seems to push to the notion that these trade-related shocks had a larger impact on joblessness in places that have higher joblessness historically. We did Nakamura-Steinson. This is, I think, even murkier still. But again, there's at least some evidence for the one-year things that you have a slightly higher impact of government contracts on joblessness in places where joblessness is higher. And again, we're not trying to make the definitive answer and claim that we've identified the places that have high joblessness elasticities. But we think it's at least possible that these places do have higher joblessness elasticities. And if they are higher, then we should be rethinking our social insurance policies to make sure we aren't inducing more people to be jobless in these areas. Okay. So the larger point is that our view of place-based policies depends upon such place-based heterogeneity. In this spirit, we're going to engage in an illustrative calculation. So the model that I have in the back of my mind is people are going to be choosing locations. They're going to be then taking a draw from the opportunity cost of working, and they're going to be deciding whether or not to work or not. Or you have a draw to their productivity, neither of which is known ex ante. We're then going to decide how much to subsidize working, how much benefit to give to people who work, and how much to give to people who don't work. You get from this a modified Bailey-Chetty formula. A formula that trades off the insurance benefits of giving people more money when they're not working with the incentive costs of deterring people from working. And what you get from that is a very clear impact that whatever you think this elasticity is, this drives you to have less generous benefits towards places where people aren't working or to subsidize work more. So we're going to then implement this. We plug in our benefit, our fiscal benefit of 0.36. We're then going to use the Bartik and Bartik interactions to estimate this heterogeneity and elasticity. It turns out the curvature of the utility function is, of course, quite important. And this gives us an idea of how generous the employment subsidy should be relative to the wage, depending on this risk aversion parameter, this gamma, and depending upon the elasticity of employment. So let's take the gamma of 0.5, which is a microeconomist. I tend to believe in numbers of like 0.5 rather than the macroeconomist, so I'll believe it's 30. But if you take a number of 0.5, it basically tells you that you want a 5% subsidy in places where the elasticity is really low, and as much as a 20% subsidy in places where it's really high. So I'm not pinning myself down on any particular number, but those differences in elasticities are not totally implausible, and they do give you the idea that you want a really different elasticity and really different subsidy in West Virginia than you do in Seattle. This does this tilt calibration, again, changing the elasticity of employment. Again, sort of a very significant tilt implied by having a place where you have lots of people on the margin. And just think, we want something in the back of your head. Just think a $15 minimum wage doesn't seem to have done anything particularly harmful to Seattle's job market, or at least one that's really visible. Does anyone really think a $15 minimum wage is going to be irrelevant in West Virginia? I mean, can anyone possibly think that that's actually a reasonable viewpoint? So we run through, these are our estimates that we run through with this. And again, depending upon what you think your coefficient of relative risk aversion is, we come up with this is an optimal consumption ratio of not working individuals to employed individuals. That's 92% in Wyoming, right? Wyoming is actually very high on, very, very low on that elasticity. It's a lot of guys who are working very, very non-responsive. So there you can actually insure people against local shocks a lot, whereas it's 72% in West Virginia. So it's potentially a really large gap in terms of how much you think you should be weighing off the incentives. Now, I don't think that that's the only thing we should be doing in this. I mean, I think in terms of wrapping together, when I think about what a sensible spatial policy would be, I would tend to think about three things, one of which is some form of targeted employment subsidy for the U.S., the second of which is some degree of reshaping of social insurance programs that reflects the fact that we don't have one economy, we have multiple ones. And third, having some degree of educational interventions that are actually more job-oriented, particularly for the young. Now, I would love, maybe David can tell us that he's finally got a whole bunch of things for retraining 50-year-olds that are fantastic, but we don't know that track record is not great, whereas the track record of vocational training for younger kids may be at least more hopeful. But I do think that's not enough, and I actually join with Oren in this, that like the track record of economists telling 50-year-old laid-off manufacturing workers that we've got nothing for them, but we've got a great pre-K program for their granddaughter, right? That's something we've done for a lot of time. That was our primary response to trade shocks, was like talking about pre-K. That's great, or education more generally, that's great, but it just doesn't feel remotely like it's enough given this avalanche of non-working men and the degree of misery that they're engaged in and the quite plausible externalities that are associated with this. I also think it's somewhat outrageous that we regulate the entrepreneurship of poor people so much more tightly in this country than we regulate the entrepreneurship of rich people. If you want to start your internet phenom in a Harvard College dorm, you basically can get a billion users and possibly hack an election before any regulator has noticed you exist. Whereas if you want to start a grocery store that sells milk products, 3 blocks away you have 17 permits to get. Right? That's a somewhat outrageous thing. But just to be clear, I'm not advocating wholesale attempts to move economic activity. I think the basic tendency of activity to move to places that are more productive is benign and helpful. I'm not advocating large-scale infrastructure attempts, right? And even the good ones, right? So this is Bilbao's art museum. This is like the big winner for some local thing. Even Bilbao's unemployment rate was 19% the last time I checked, and that was like a really successful museum. I mean, these things look more often like this is Sheffield's National Centre for Popular Music in England. This one was supposed to regenerate Sheffield. It closed within the year. Right? So infrastructure is just a great way to waste trillions of dollars if it's done for reasons that are other than cost-benefit analysis around the actual users. And so it's, we need to stay focused on what we think are the real externalities, what we think are the real loss. And I think joblessness is plausibly a really important one. And I think thinking not just about the Fed's short-term objectives, but about long-run reforms that actually work to push against the rise of joblessness for prime-age men in America is worth doing. Okay, with that, I'm done. But thank you all very much for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you. My question is pretty quick. I was wondering if you have a sense of what incarceration and having some form of prison records, how that would be playing a role in what you're seeing in joblessness in your work, especially when we're talking about blackmail and living with one's parents.
So I have not myself worked on incarceration, although I have certainly done some work on law and economics and punishment. You do see that these incarceration rates are particularly, no, this is education, this is not incarceration, wait. Where's incarceration? Incarceration is here, this is incarceration. It looks kind of similar. So incarceration rates are real, are higher in these areas, and it's potentially a real deal. And one thing to particularly think about, in declining features of the areas of the US, the largest employers are healthcare and social assistance. Okay, you can actually look at this in the US. There's sort of three parts of US cities. One part has still got some degree of manufacturing area that's the largest employer. One share that's moved on to some sort of finance, insurance, and real estate type thing, some high intensity thing. But in the poorest, most declining parts of America, the dominant industrial sector is always healthcare and social insurance. And hospitals, schools, they don't hire convicted felons, right? We've got rules about that. And consequently, that makes things particularly hard for this. So it's not just the general convicted felon thing, it's the interaction between being a convicted felon and being an area in which the most robust employer has very clear rules that says you cannot apply here. So I think this is a big area that actually deserves more attention. Yes?
So, Ed, I hope this is working. This was great. It was perhaps the most coherent argument I've heard so far for so-called place-based policies, which I always had trouble understanding. But what it made me think about is something different. So I'll tell you what it made me think about. The notion that the United States and say, India should have exactly the same policies, people would dismiss as being obviously absurd.
Right.
In exactly the same way, the idea that West Virginia and Connecticut should have exactly the same policies also seems absurd. Less absurd, but also absurd. So for 150 years of this republic, we adopted a particular mechanism to ensure that we got heterogeneity in policy associated with heterogeneity in local economic circumstance. And that was that the states did the bulk of this kind of work. The federal government was restricted primarily to national externalities and national public goods. That at least was the principle. It wasn't always carried out, but that was the basic idea. Rather than your particular subsidies, I particularly like the fact that you were doing budget neutral changes rather than imagining weird aggregate demand externalities that spill over the whole nation. Bob Lucas's training did help there. No, but once you think about it that way, why isn't this a clarion call for us to return to a system where the primary responsibility for addressing place-based external effects and directing place-based policies is at the state level with minimal direction? That minimal direction is really important from the federal level, except that the federal government still presumably is given the responsibility of enforcing private property rights, which is what zoning typically ends up limiting. So why isn't this a clarion call for decentralizing to the state level, for enforcing private property rights, and so on.
Well, in general, of course, I view this as being a comment that I'm deeply sympathetic with. And let me not take the property rights side, which we're 100% in agreement on. So that's a different issue. Let me also say, because you've set me up and I can't resist it, the Mumbai is one of the more NIMBYous cities in the world. And it's one of the world's most NIMBY cities because in 1968, Mumbai decided to relatively slavishly copy the British Town and Country Planning Act. Now, I submit to you that any Town and Country Planning Act, any zoning rules that are appropriate for rural Dorset or Yorkshire are inappropriate for a city of 10 million people that has one-tenth the incomes, and that is surely correct. So I'm certainly calling for local heterogeneity. The question is, can we be sure that we would trust the states to do it correctly? And I think so. Let me say so that the one area which I've never been particularly confident about state control is whatever redistribution we think should go on between rich and poor people. There's a good argument that at least the levels of that should be set at the national level rather than the local level, right? That sort of when cities try to do their own welfare state, then rich people and firms just leave, and whatever we think we should be doing for rich people, presumably it should be done nationally. And this falls a little bit in the sense that sort of if the levels are set at the national level of whatever we think we're spending on that, and then we have more local control as to what to do with that money, I view that as being a reasonable thing to do. But I do worry about the tendency to have a race to the bottom if you have sort of the locality setting the level as well as shaping the form. Because we do certainly have a track record of, let's say, states with particularly high levels of African Americans prior to Welfare Act of Welfare Reform in 1994, of having particularly low, generous AFDC payments. So I think some local control is appropriate. I think some local heterogeneity is absolutely necessary. But I would worry about 100% ceding of control to localities unless I had figured out what the political incentives were at that local level to potentially undo things that I would want to achieve. Yes.
I'd like to build off a little bit of your response to that question. And one reason for federal intervention is you can imagine a lot of the history of racial discrimination, and even the states that got earlier waves of the Great Migration seem to track with lower investment institutions, higher incarceration rates, things like this. So I am just curious if you have looked at your proposals and considered how they might have racial equity sort of implications if you are having lower rates. I know you're using Seattle and West Virginia as your general example, so I'm just curious if, say, the structure of these programs changed in a way that influenced people in, for example, areas that tended to be more rural and white versus urban areas that are more diverse. So yeah, I'm just curious about the racial component, which was one thing that was missing in your presentation. I know it's a big...
There are versions of this. I mean, the original version of the Brookings paper had like 120 pages and had like 40 figures with complete cuts by race on everything. I mean, these trends tend to be parallel by race over areas. I mean, so I think certainly we're right to worry about these issues. I'm not sure in particular that, as I've written it down, that it would be, move things towards, whereas, if I'm not sure that it would be particularly pro-white or pro-minority in terms of the having high joblessness rates. There's typically slightly higher minority, and so if you thought you were giving them more benefits in those states, then that would be against white benefit, pro-minority benefits. But it's not, the basic point here is that you want to target the incentives where the elasticities are higher, right? That's the point. And I have some evidence to suggest the elasticities are higher in places with high joblessness rates. But I think before we have this debate about racial equity, we should figure out whether or not that's actually the right way to target it and whether or not we're sure that's where the elasticities are higher. But I think being aware of what the racial consequences of it are, is always a first order thing to do. Any yes? Oren, okay.
Taking what we know from Otter et al. Regarding the effects of trade on joblessness and your externalities-based analysis of how we should react to joblessness, what lessons do you think that would have for international trade? And if you want to take the view that, well, the China shock happened and it's never going to happen again, what in hindsight would you say we should have done differently over the last decade?
Look, I think there's no question. I mean, we have been, as economists, we have been on a pro-trade agenda since 1776. and it's died in our spirit, and the pure, clean air of the Scottish Enlightenment lives on in us, and by and large, that's a very, very good thing. Right? But it is also true, because we are so enthusiastic about pushing for free trade, that we have occasionally, while in our zeal, underestimated the fact that, as we always knew from our models, there would be winners and losers, right? And we always, when we're making, whether it's a pitch for, NAFTA or TPP, we always underestimated that. And because we, in some sense, had mentally underestimated as part of making our pitch, many of us didn't even think there were going to be losers, right? We thought it was all going to be such a fantastic thing to have all these open markets, we didn't even think about this. And if one thing I think is clear, and David's work has made this apparent, and I think you're right on this as well, we need to be more focused on what are the potential downsides of future trade changes, and make sure that we have policies in place that are likely to work against the externalities that are associated with this, or against the equity concerns that are associated with that. I think that's exactly true. Now, I do tend to think that it's not obvious to me that the jobs that were displaced by China are going to come back if we suddenly impose tariffs on that. I'm happy to cede to David on that. He's shaking his head, so that must mean that he thinks it's not going to happen. But that doesn't in any sense eliminate the fact that we're going to have future shocks that are going to go on. There are going to be future shocks that are trade-related. There are going to be future shocks that are not trade-related. And the big elephant in the room is, again, this future of work thing, and automation and mechanization, right? Which I share a certain amount of your skepticism about what that's going to do, but it's certainly there as a possibility of something which can lead to major changes in demand for less skilled workers. And the vision that at least one part of the political spectrum has, which is, look, we're just going to pay people a universal basic income. And we're going to create 40% of America that's going to be on the dole in perpetuity, and they're going to be getting a check. And isn't it great, because I started my .com because someone gave me an extra check so I could take 3 months off. That bears no resemblance to what I see not working men as their lives. And a world in which you have 40% of America on the dole seems to be a world in which we're going to spend all our political time debating how big that dole is. And it seems like a world which, maybe in Giannis's world, it's like a path-dependent world that leads us down towards something that feels very, very bleak to me. Whereas, at least when I think about it, the right response to, if you think there are externalities associated with joblessness, whether or not the pure fiscal ones, which, and Pigou was writing about the fiscal externalities associated with joblessness in 1912. Okay, this is not a new thing. And if you think there are other externalities related to social decomposition, or what happens to kids, or how much parents have to pay, this is a reason to have some form of either change in the benefits for not working, or some form of subsidy that pushes back on that. And I think we should have had that in place. We should have been thinking about that 20 years ago, and I think we should still be thinking about it now. Now, there is a question which I didn't say anything, because I'm too much of a microeconomist to really believe that it makes a difference whether or not you pay the money to the workers, you pay the money to the firm. If you do think that things like minimum wages are binding fairly sharply, then my co-author is in fact more enthusiastic about giving this to firms in West Virginia to encourage them to form. And again, it depends upon how much you think there's equivalence on that as well.
We go one last question.
Okay. We gotta take two. If we've got David and the president, we should. Can we?
I'm happy to cede to the president. Really quick. So I think it's very clever. I think what you did is great. I think it's very clever. You've captured all in terms of elasticities and misery and so on, and mobility, and it's all in terms of the labor supply parameter. But it still doesn't. It doesn't explain how we got to this point, or why things changed so much, or why the central heartland diverged so much. And you don't need that to do this welfare calculation statically. But if we want to say, well, how much more will places diverge? Or if we give these subsidies, can we expect some reconvergence? That would help to think about the long run equilibrium even after we implement this set of policies.
I agree with that completely. That's completely right. Nor do I think I completely understand how we got here, quite honestly. And we're 3/4 done with the book that we're writing on this, but the book of how we got, the chapter 3 on how we got here is still, even saying how much of this is like a labor demand shock versus a labor supply shock, there's no convergence either between the data or the authors on our views on this. Neil.
Thank you. One of the charts showed similar trends in our sister countries. Is there anything that you've taken away looking at what's happening in other countries to either explain it, maybe it's the exact same phenomenon, or their response to it? What can we learn looking abroad?
I haven't thought enough about that. There are some countries, in particularly Scandinavia, there's much stronger employment subsidies than we do. But of course, looking to Scandinavia is always a hard thing to judge anything on it, and I was not inclined to yet again extol the virtues of the vocational training system in Germany, which, it's true, but the question is, can we possibly duplicate what they do well there here? So I think it is really interesting to I mean, and many of the same labor market phenomena are going on, decline in...
Same trade shock from around the
Same
world.
trade shock, same decline in manufacturing employment, coupled with a generous welfare state that enables you to not work if you so choose to do so. So those things are continuing to collide. But I don't have a view in my head about why this looks so much better than this.
Yeah, I was more focusing on the decline.
The general, but I think it's it's some combination of labor demand and labor supply, some combination of declining demand for the low wage workers, combining with the fact that they don't that they don't have to work in the same sense that historically prior to 1960 we were frequently hit with major shocks to labor demand. Right? But because we didn't have a viable welfare state, the guys got back to work, right? Wages adjusted relatively sharply, whether or not in 1893 or the 1907, right? But the post welfare state, that doesn't happen anymore. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have the welfare state, but that's going to be an occurrence is when labor demand shocks run into this stuff, and that's certainly what we see there. I think a reasonable view is they do a better job of educating their least wealthy kids. They do a better job at the low end of the educational spectrum. That I would say that probably of almost all of these particular 5 countries that they're better on that. And that's at least one view as to what's happening differently.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you.